welcome to Beth Ahm. It's always a pleasure to be here. I love speaking anywhere in the community. It seems the audience is actually, it's a lot of the same people, which I appreciate. But I have a special love of speaking at Beth Ahm because, I belong to Beth Ahm. Normally, on Saturday morning, I read Torah from this spot. So I'm going to use a very different part of my brain and a very different persona. But if I accidentally start reading Torah here, you will know why. But welcome to Beth Ahm. It's a lovely shul. If you have your own shul, great. If you're shopping for a shul, or if you're thinking, if you need a shul, this is a great shul. Okay. So what we're going to do, and thank you, David and David, for getting all this together. So what we're going to do, let me make it clear what we're going to do in this series. Normally, when I give a series on some topic or a lecture on some topic, we look at something in the past and we explain and understand what happened. That's basically what you do when you study history. This time we're going to do something a little bit different. Like David said, we're going to imagine how things could have turned out differently. Now, that's not a very historical question. Counterfactual question like that is something historians normally don't do. But I want to make it clear that on one hand, yes, this is going to be speculative. I don't have access to a time machine. I can't go back and change time and see. I don't have access to the multiverse or alternate dimensions or the reality stone, if you're fans of the Marvel Universe. So I can't say for sure. No one can say for sure what would have happened. But there is a way we can speculate in this way in a more educated and informed fashion. So what I'd like to do in this series, each week, I want to use two questions, or two kinds of questions, that historians, people who study the past, and I mean not only professional historians, but also historians by avocation, anyone interested in history, two very useful questions that will help us even for a series like this. So the first question is asking what the impact of an event was. It's an important question. That's number one, and I think that's pretty straightforward. Why was this event significant? What did it alter about what came next? What did it shape? And the other question is that historians love to ask has to do with how do we understand what we might call, we call it either a capstone moment or a watershed moment or a turning point event, a significant moment. How do we put that in the larger context of a longer trajectory of change and continuity? Now, we're going to do both of those things in this series. Each week, whatever the watershed moment, the capstone event in question, first we're going to ask what the impact was to get a good, clear understanding. And then second, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that moment and ask the question, okay, that was a moment of significant change, but which of those, what of that change, how much of that change had already taken place? In other words, even a moment as decisive as the destruction of the temple, or next week, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which are, no question, significant events to say the least, and nothing I'm going to say during this series is going to diminish the significance and the impact of these events. But we can ask the question, why were these events important? What was their impact? And what had already happened leading up to that event? And that will help us when we speculate what would have happened or what might have happened. What if? We can do it in a more educated way. We can have some actual knowledge to go for. So I say that by way of introduction. What I just said will become clearer as we dive into the specifics of each event. One other thing is I see many familiar faces. Welcome back. For those of you who are new, typically my routine is I do my spiel and we have questions at the end. So I'll probably talk, 45, whatever it is. If you have a question, make a mental note, jot it down, whatever, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. And of course, in a series like this, I'll be very curious to hear your questions. Okay. So with that in mind, let's dive in. So the topic for this evening is what if the second temple had not been destroyed. So let me make sure everyone's clear what we're talking about. There were two times when the Beit HaMikdash, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The first was by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. The second was by the Romans in 70 CE. I'm talking about the second one, and I think it'll be clear soon enough why I'm talking about the second one, because these are very different questions, all right? So the short version of the story is, during the years leading up to 70 CE, the Jews who lived in Judea, in the land of Israel, revolted against the Romans. This revolt was defeated soundly, and in 70 CE, the Romans, winning this war, crushing this revolt, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, exiled many, though certainly not all Jews, outside the land of Israel, and destroyed the temple. And that's the last time we've had a temple in Jerusalem. Okay. And when we talk about the impact of this event, there's a number of things we can list. So let's start there. Let's be clear what we understand is the impact. First of all, the destruction of the temple itself. The temple, until its destruction, was first and foremost the religious center of the Jewish world. That was the address where Jews would go to talk to God. At that point, the most long-standing method of prayer was in the form of sacrifice. You would bring an animal, you would give it to one of the priests, they would offer it to God, and that would be the delivery system, so to speak, of prayer. So the temple was the religious and theological center of the Jewish world. Not only in terms of prayer, it was also the most sacred space in the Jewish world. You know, in the Jewish concept of holiness, Kedusha, there's a hierarchy of time. Some times are more holier than others, like Shabbat is more holier than the rest of the days of the week, and holidays are more sacred. But there's also a hierarchy of place. So, compared to the whole Jewish world, the land of Israel is more sacred than anywhere else. Within the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem is more sacred. Within the city of Jerusalem, the temple is more sacred. And of course, at the apex of this hierarchy of space is the Holy of Holies, Kodesh Kodashim, Sanctum Sanctorum. That was the most sacred space. And so it wasn't just the destruction of the place where the center of Jewish prayer, it was also the destruction of the most sacred Jewish space in the world. In addition, the temple and the city of Jerusalem around it was not only the religious center and the center of holiness in the Jewish world, it was also the economic and political center of the Jewish world. The city of Jerusalem was the capital of a sovereign Jewish kingdom called Judea, which was really the end of several centuries of Jewish sovereignty. The destruction of the temple and the accompanying destruction of Jerusalem ended Jewish sovereignty until the 20th century. That's a pretty big deal. And lastly, I would say in terms of impact, until the destruction of the temple, the center of the Jewish world was unquestionably in the land of Israel and in the city of Jerusalem. From the moment the temple was destroyed, that center began to move elsewhere. First, elsewhere in the land of Israel. The Sanhedrin, which had been in Jerusalem for several centuries. First, it moved south to a city called Yavna. Then it went to Tiberias in the Galilee. And later, when the Sanhedrin was shut down, Babylonia became the center of the Jewish world. And after that, Spain became the center of the Jewish world. And then Eastern Europe became the center of the Jewish world. And then America became the center of the Jewish world. Until finally, in the 20th century, there was a renewed center in the land of Israel. But for a long time, there was this dramatic shift in the center of Jewish life globally. In other words, Judaism and being Jewish after the destruction of the temple was almost exclusively oriented around the diaspora. Now, Jews always had. There are always Jews who lived in the land of Israel, and Jews had a deep connection to the land of Israel, but being Jewish became something diaspora, because there were far more Jews who lived in the diaspora than in the land of Israel. So there are these multiple impacts of this seminal, pivotal event. So now the question we can ask, this is the question I said. This was the impact of the destruction of the Second Temple. Had any of these changes, had any of these seismic changes in Jewish life that would define Jewish life for centuries after the destruction of the temple, really all the way into the 20th century, had any of these seismic changes happened or begun to happen prior to the destruction of the temple? This is what I mean by taking this capstone moment and asking, well, had any of these changes already begun? Because that makes things a little bit different. Well, the answer obviously is yes, because if the answer wasn't yes, then we could be done right now. But so I'm sorry to say, the answer is yes, so now you have to listen to the rest of this, okay? So, before I enumerate those changes which had already begun, let me first place the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem in a broader global context. Because it turns out that the changes that really were marked by the destruction of the temple, and as we'll see, that had begun before, these were not uniquely Jewish changes. They were parallel changes in other cultures as well. Now, when I say parallel here, I'm talking about parallel, I'm not talking about causality. The destruction of the temple, or none of these were caused by what I'm about to enumerate, but there was something, the world was changing. Now, there was a historian about 100 years ago who came up with a term to describe this global change in religion in general, in the relationship to God and prayer, religion in general, not only in the land of Israel, but everywhere in the world, from China to India, the land of Israel, other places. And the term he used for it was the axial age. You know, he was a German historian, so he called der Achselzeit, the axial age. Now, he used the phrase axial to give a sense that the whole nature of religion in the world was rotating to something new. It was pivoting. So what did he mean by the axial age? First of all, here are the parallel events he was talking about. The following historical figures lived at roughly the same period of time in different places. Confucius, the Buddha, Zoroaster, who was Zarathustra, who was the founder of a religion in Iran, and the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. They were all roughly contemporaries of one another. And so where's the parallel? Well, there are a number of smaller parallels, but the main one is there seems to be this global shift from a religion, a form of religion we might describe as institutional, or the other word is cultic, which is a social science way of saying religion that is organized around public sacrifice and a priesthood as conduits of talking to God. There's a shift globally away from a religion which is institutional, structured around a temple or a shrine, a central place, and sacrifice, in the direction of religion which is personal. So, in the religious teachings preached by Confucius and the Buddha and Zoroaster and prophets like Jeremiah, there is a shift away from sacrifice in the direction of personal prayer, and religion itself is being more oriented less around some central great temple and more around something personal. And we're still living in the aftermath of that, because religion for us is personal. We believe, whatever religion you are, certainly most Western religions, we believe it's possible to talk to God directly. That was a radical, a new idea a couple thousand years ago, but that change to that idea happened in a number of different places at the same time, including in the land of Israel. And so the decentralizing of the singular importance of the temple, which revolved around, well, we would say a cult of sacrifice, not a cult in the bad sense, a system of sacrifices and priesthood. That was something that had begun long before the destruction of the temple, and it was happening elsewhere as well. So that certainly is something worth considering in trying to measure what the impact was and how, and the changes that were already in motion. Okay. So let's talk about that significant change. Let's talk about it in two ways. Actually, let's talk about it in three ways. Let's talk about it in terms first of exile and diaspora. In other words, a kind of geographic relocating of the centers of Judaism. Let's talk about it in terms of prayer, with the emergence of institutions of or places of personal prayer. The most notable is the synagogue. And finally, the role of the priesthood. Let's take those one at a time. First of all, and this is one of the reasons why I chose the Second Temple as opposed to the First Temple. The destruction of the Second Temple was extraordinarily difficult for Jews. That is an understatement. But one of the things which made it easier for Jews to come to terms with and handle that traumatic, cataclysmic moment is being the Second Temple being destroyed. There already was a precedent as to how to respond to the destruction of a temple. This is what I mean. This goes all the way back to the prophet Jeremiah. Now, the prophet Jeremiah, he was a prophet in ancient Israel from the 600s BCE into the 500s BCE. He was a prophet during the first destruction of the first temple. He was a prophet who started when the temple was there and the kingdom of David and Solomon was still there. You know, their descendants were still running it. But he also went into exile with Jews who went into exile after the destruction of the first temple. And one of the things that Jeremiah is going to do for us, not only Jeremiah, but Jeremiah is going to define for us the possibility of being Jewish outside the land of Israel. Now, before the destruction of the first temple, it wasn't clear to anyone if that was possible. I'll give you an example. There were some Jews who, following the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, simply they thought it was over. They thought being Jewish, the Jewish people, it's all over. You know, they left us some of their thoughts. For example, you know, some of these Jews they wrote down one of the Psalms. I know the Psalms are usually attributed to David, but there are some Psalms that were written by Jews in exile, and this is one that might be familiar to you. Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zachrenu Et Zion. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept as we remembered Zion. These are Jews sent into exile following that destruction who had given up. They had despaired of any continuity. In their minds, it was over. And they go on to say, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, no future whatsoever. If that had been the only response, we wouldn't be here right now. It simply would have ended. But that was not the only response. In fact, that wasn't even the dominant or the most impactful response. The one that really would take root is what Jeremiah said. Now, if you look at your handout, I assume everyone has a handout. Text number 3. We're going to go a little out of order tonight. Text number 3, this is Jeremiah chapter 29. I would say this is probably one of the most underrated passages in the Tanakh in terms of its importance. You know, Jeremiah, spoiler alert, full disclosure, he's my favorite prophet. I love the prophet Jeremiah as prophets go. He just said very important things. So this is let's call it an open letter he wrote to Jews in exile who are experiencing exile for the first time. And he's writing this contra to the mentality of despair and it's over. So this is text number 3. Okay, Eile divrei hasefer. This is the text of the letter, which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, the rest of the elders of the exiled community, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Okay? This is Jeremiah's instruction to the Jews who are living for the first time outside the land of Israel and without the temple. And he says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. He says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. In other words, what's Jeremiah's message in a nutshell? Live. There is a possibility for life to go on as Jews outside the land of Israel. In terms of how we describe where Jews are, until this moment, the only concept Jews had was exile, being uprooted, being dislocated. what Jeremiah is going to invent, even though the word had not been invented yet, hadn't been coined yet, he's going to invent the concept of the diaspora, a place outside the land of Israel, which for Jews doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation. It's possible to be Jewish outside the land of Israel. And he goes on to say, seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. This is his message of civic responsibility. Not only is it possible to live as Jews outside the land of Israel, but you shall be part of these other societies, the other places where you live. That's the diaspora. If Jeremiah saw how we live as Americans right now, we're Jewish, we're in the synagogue, but we're also part of mainstream society, 1 foot Jewish, 1 foot in the other. He would say, exactly, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly what I meant. So Jeremiah created a mentality for Jews in which, even without the temple, the notion that Judaism ends is simply, that's not the dominant mentality. So when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, Jews were already programmed or hardwired with the idea that, yes, this is a calamity, a tragedy. It's going to change our lives, but it doesn't mean it's the end. That idea was pre-existing. Okay, next. One of the other significant changes about the destruction of the temple was it was the center of prayer. And the question came up, does this mean that prayer to God is no longer possible? Are Jews cut off from God without the temple? If we can't offer sacrifices of thanks and praise and petition without korbanot, how are we going to have a relationship to God? Well, this was also something that had come up even before the destruction of the temple, and even before the destruction of the first temple. Because one of the things that the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah were very busy doing, part of their message, part of their message was no idolatry. They condemned idolatry. Part of their message was a message of, I would call it social morality. Be kind to the poor, to the stranger, to the orphan, to the powerless. But also, they were fierce critics of corruption in the temple and fierce critics of the sacrificial service. Jeremiah and Isaiah were the original advocates of personal prayer as an alternative to sacrifice. Let's look at a couple of examples. Look at text number 1. This comes from the very first chapter of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah lived in the 700s BCE, okay? Now remember, he's standing in the temple, a short distance away from where the sacrifices are still being offered, because even the first temple hadn't been destroyed yet. And in the temple, he says, text number 1, Lama li rov zivrechem yomar Adonai. What need have I of all your sacrifices? Am I sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls, yada yada? And have I no delight in lambs and I have no delight in lambs and he-goats? That you come to appear before me. Who asked that of you? Basically what he's saying is, the mentality he's talking about are people who bring sacrifices. I think that's all they have to do. They bring a sacrifice and good. I have carte blanche to do whatever I want as long as I atone with a sacrifice. It always kind of reminds me of, I know this is a little bit stereotypical. In a typical mafia movie, when you have the mafia guy, the hitman goes and kills someone and then goes to confession and gets absolved. That's the mentality that Isaiah is talking about. No. You can't just bring a sacrifice and be absolved. You have to live as a good and moral person. The prophets were the original advocates of social justice. All right? And the prophet Jeremiah, a century and a half later, echoed a similar message. Look at text number 2. This one's even more dramatic, because in addition to Jews thinking that sacrifices in the temple would always protect them, there was this notion that the temple and the city of Jerusalem was invincible. So no matter how bad the Jewish people misbehaved, no matter how bad the ancient Israelites did, no matter how many moral laws they violated, as long as they were in the city of Jerusalem, that would never be destroyed because there was this unconditional promise of protection from God. And so here, Jeremiah in chapter 7, a story that's actually appears twice in the book of Jeremiah. It's repeated in chapter 26, which shows you how important it is. All right, I love this story. Check text number 2. Hadavar asher haya el Yirmiyahu me'et Adonai. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Jeremiah is told by God to do the following. Stand at the gate of the house of the Lord, and there proclaim this word. Hear the word of the Lord, and all you of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Okay? In other words, this is his message for people who are bringing sacrifices to the temple, thinking that A, they're going to be absolved for all their transgressions, and they're 100% safe in Jerusalem. Nothing bad can happen no matter what we do. He says, thus says the Lord of hosts, mend your ways and your actions, all right? And I will let you dwell this. In other words, atone, repent. You can't live immoral lives. And here's the one. Don't put your trust in illusions. In other words, don't believe false prophets or false messengers who say, Heichal Adonai, Heichal Adonai, Heichal Adonai Hema. Don't believe anyone who says the sanctuary of God, the sanctuary of God, this is the sanctuary of God. Therefore, we're safe no matter what we do. Jeremiah says no. That's wrong. You have to accompany this relationship with God with a moral relationship with others. And the common thread between Isaiah and Jeremiah here is that both are underscoring a flaw in the sacrificial system and an over-reliance on sacrifice, as opposed to sacrifice has become a kind of replacement, not for everybody, but apparently for many, for being moral and worrying about consequences of your actions. This is something very different. Now, what this is going to do, as time went on, is going to lay the basis for the emergence, first in the diaspora and then in the land of Israel, of not only new ways to communicate to God, but also new places to communicate to God. And here we have the emergence at some point, probably in the 200s BCE or so, we don't know exactly, of two new institutions, one of which I'm sure you've heard of, I'm saying that facetiously, the synagogue as a place of prayer, and the other is called in Greek the prosoika. Now, let me tell you what each of those two means. Synagogue literally has, the word synagogue in Greek or synagoga, has nothing to do with prayer. Like the Hebrew word Beit Knesset, it simply means house of assembly. It's a place where Jews gathered. The other word, pros means near in Greek, and oicha is like the word Eucharist. It is definitely a place of prayer. So there were two new kinds of places of prayer. The synagogues were typically in the land of Israel, and originally, synagogues were not places where Jews gathered to pray, because let's say there was a synagogue in or near the city of Jerusalem. Prayer was down the road in the temple. So what did you do? What were Jews gathering to do in the synagogue, other than schmooze and do business and the usual things we do in the synagogue, and eat, obviously. But the main thing was to study the text of the Torah. The oldest part of the synagogue service is the Torah reading. Before there was the rest of the liturgy, Jews would gather to read and hear the study of Torah text. And that was also essential in the diaspora as well, because when synagogues would be founded as synagogues in the diaspora, they didn't have direct connection to the temple. Studying the words of the Torah was very important. Now, in the other, a prosoika is a house of prayer. This was, especially in the diaspora, designed for Jews who not only, they didn't visit the temple. If you lived in Babylonia, it was a difficult journey. Even if you lived in Alexandria in Egypt, it was a difficult journey. But in both those cases, not only did you not go to the temple on any regular basis, for most Jews, they couldn't even imagine the possibility of ever going to the temple, seeing the sacrifice. There were no books, there were no TV shows, there was no social media. So for these Jews, prayer, liturgy, a personal connection, a personal communication with God, that became the dominant form of prayer. Now, all of this happened long before the Second Temple was destroyed. So the end of sacrifice was buoyed, first of all, or the impact was lessened in a way First of all, by an understanding that Jewish life in the diaspora is possible. But secondly, that there already was a ready-made and pretty well-developed alternative to sacrifice. So that panic of, how are we possibly going to pray to God without the temple? They already had the answer. Oh, we've got the synagogue, we've got the proselyte. We already know how to do it. We've already got prayers we can say. We have the reading of the Torah. One of the things that the early rabbis are going to say is, when sacrifices in the temple stopped, what's going to replace the sacrifices, among other things, in addition to personal prayer in the synagogue, is going to be studying texts about the sacrifices. When we read about the sacrifices, it's one of the reasons why we read them. We can't do them anymore, but studying text isn't just about learning, it becomes a ritual, a religious act, a religious replacement, and all of this is in place. Okay. Now, in addition to all of that, there's one other thing which also, which made the destruction of the temple maybe a notch less cataclysmic. And this is what I would call the devolution of the priesthood. Now, the priests, the Kohanim, they were the ones who were in charge of the second temple and the first temple, and before the first temple, the tabernacle. This was a special caste within the people of Israel. Their jobs was to basically monitor the sacrifices. But one of the things that happens first in the Tanakh, and especially more in the post-biblical period, is what I call the devolution of the priesthood. The priesthood, as time goes on, its integrity becomes less and less pure. It's corrupted. As we'll see, by the time we get to the moment the temple is destroyed, well, the priesthood's not going to be it's not going to be that same priesthood anymore. So let me tell you what I mean by the devolution of the priesthood. So first of all, the first moment where the priesthood changes, the original priests were the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. We call them the Bnei Aharon, the Aaronite priests. King David, according to the book of Kings, 2 Samuel, when King David conquers the city of Jerusalem, one of the first things he does to solidify his hold over his kingdom is he creates a second line of priesthood called these Zadokite priests. Most historians believed this was the indigenous priesthood of the city of Jerusalem, which David basically converted, turned them into Israelites, and they became a second priesthood. So already in the time of David, that pure line Aaronite priesthood was already beginning to change. Secondly, I'm skipping forward a little bit. At the time of the Maccabees, before the Maccabean revolt, the priesthood, and especially the Jerusalem priests, were the most Hellenistic element of Jewish society. They were the most Greek, we would say the most assimilated or acculturated. I know that sounds weird. They were offering the sacrifices, they were still religiously observant, but because they tended to be the wealthiest, they had the most access to Greek culture. But because of that, and initially that was fine, but at a certain point during the years leading up to the Maccabean revolt, the kings, the Greek kings who are ruling in the land of Israel, they basically begin to co-opt the support of the priests, and different families within the temple priesthood begin to make deals with these kings. The priests are not these pure priests anymore. They actually become more, I would say they're more politicized and more easily corruptible. Finally, and again, I'm going to skip another century forward, during the reign of King Herod the Great, Horus. King Herod the Great, this is 37 BCE to 4 BCE. One of the changes that Herod did as king of Judea is he says, it used to be that priests were appointed, by heredity. One would inherit from the father. No more. I'm going to appoint as high priest anyone I want. So a century before the temple was destroyed, the temple priesthood had lost a lot of its allure, a lot of its charisma. More and more Jews were looking at the temple priesthood, in some sense, at the temple itself, as a more and more corrupt institution. It wasn't helped by the fact that the temple priesthood was part of the Jewish upper class, and they were basically mistreating the Jewish poor. There was a mistrust of the priestly leadership. The temple had an image of being corrupted. Now, all of that the emergence of the concept of diaspora, the emergence of prayer as an alternative to sacrifice, and the devolution of the priesthood, all of that had preceded the destruction of the Second Temple. So when the Second Temple was destroyed, first of all, as much as Jews still regarded it as this great sacred space and its destruction a catastrophe, Jews were already starting to ask the question, is the temple the same what it always was? It doesn't seem to be the great grand center of Jewish life. It's tainted in certain ways. Still the temple, but not that same temple that we heard about back in the good old days. There was a kind of disillusionment with the temple. Okay? That's what we have. Now, I want to mention one more thing that changed as well to help us understand, the significance of the destruction. During the century prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, in other words, let's say from, maybe 150 BCE to the destruction of the Second Temple, we have the emergence within Jewish life in the land of Israel of multiple Jewish identities. Now, the term that was typically used to describe these different ways to be Jewish were Jewish sects: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots. Turns out sect is not quite the right word. Long story short, the reason we call them sects is because it was a mistranslation of a word that the first century historian Josephus used to describe them. Calling them sects is a bit of a misnomer, but it's a significant one. It makes more sense to call these either Jewish mentalities or maybe Jewish outlooks. And the reason that it's not just semantic is sect has a sense of being separate, that the Pharisees and Sadducees and the other were separate and mutually exclusive forms of Judaism. They weren't. There was still one big mishmash of Jews, but they were these very specific mentalities. Now, what these different mentalities believed, I could spend an hour explaining it to you, but the point I want to make is that there's a difference between, there were four sects, there was a difference between one versus the other three. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, they believed different things, but one of the common threads between them was what we might call accommodation. They were all fine with foreign rule, being Jewish under foreign rule. In other words, they really had imbibed that experience of the diaspora. Even though they had come back to the land of Israel, they're okay with living under Roman rule for different reasons. The Essenes regarded all of civilization as corrupt, and it didn't matter who was ruling. The Sadducees, as long as the temple service was still intact, it's okay that you're being ruled by the Romans. And the Pharisees, as long as Jews are allowed to practice Judaism, living under the Romans is fine. The only one of the sects that refused to accommodate Roman rule were the Zealots. Now, these were fanatics. These were hard extremists. Both political extremists who wanted nothing Roman there. They were religious extremists who regarded themselves as the only true, pure Jews. They're the ones who started the revolt against the Romans in 66 CE. They are the only Jews who wanted to revolt. And in retrospect, it's really too bad, because that revolt was, in retrospect, I don't know if they were aware of it or not, there was no chance of winning that revolt. The Maccabean revolt was successful for a number of reasons, among which, during the Maccabean revolt, when Jews were fighting the Greeks were in a position of weakness. And that's what made it possible. The Romans, during that revolt, were at the peak of their game. I like to tell my students, I like to make this analogy. The Jews revolting against the Romans would be like me getting 4 of my friends and challenging the Pistons to a game of 5-on-5. Well, maybe not the Pistons, the Lakers to a game of 5-on-5. No chance. The Romans were so much more advanced, and that's why most Jews, other than the Zealots, didn't want to do it, but the Zealot mentality prevailed, leading to the revolt, leading to the destruction. But this mentality of accommodation also softened the blow of the destruction of the temple. So with all these, where does it leave us? Now we have the ability to ask ourselves, if the temple had not been destroyed, what would the Jewish world have looked like, even if the temple had stood? And here I would say, let me start with 2 things. Let's see where this goes. So first of all, the diaspora, by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, most Jews lived in the diaspora. Most Jews lived in Babylonia or in Egypt. It's one of those interesting stories, when Jews were exiled during the first exile in 586, a couple generations later they were allowed to return to the land of Israel by the Persian king Cyrus. Only a third of the Jews came back from Babylonia. 2/3 stayed. In other words, they said, we can go back to Jerusalem, to the land of Israel. Fine, that's wonderful if you want to go. We like it here in Babylonia. We're staying. And from that point on, that's the great ancient Jewish community of Babylonia, which later became Iraq, lasted all the way until the 20th century. But that becomes a hallmark. So for most Jews, the destruction of the temple, if you're already living in the diaspora, you're already living in the diaspora. Now, it means you no longer have the temple for leadership. And the focal points of Jewish leadership is going to shift to the diaspora, but the possibility of living in the diaspora is already there. Secondly, isn't it that the possibility of prayer already existed? For most Jews, sacrifice was something that was done in Jerusalem, and certainly regarded, esteemed as being sacred by Jews everywhere. But most Jews in the world, diaspora Jews, did not personally rely on sacrifice anymore. So there was a kind of devastation. But it was kind of a removed devastation. In other words, it was still possible to be Jewish. And finally, this notion of accommodating foreign rule. If you lived in the diaspora, or if you were a Jew who was living in Israel and was exiled to the diaspora, you already knew from Jeremiah, you already knew from established Jewish communities that life in the diaspora was possible. Let me give you a couple of examples of not just that it was possible, but of a mentality which said that being Jewish in the diaspora is almost comparable to being Jewish in the land of Israel. Look at text number 4, okay? Now this is a passage from the Talmud, all right? And it's really describing the relationship between Jews and God, the chosenness of Jews, in the land of Israel versus the diaspora, okay? All right. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who was, long story short, student of Rabbi Akiva, traditionally is considered the father of Jewish mysticism. Okay. Come and see. Ba'ureh. Come and see how beloved the Jewish people are before the Holy One, blessed be He. At every place they were exiled, the divine presence went with them. Shechina imahem. The presence of God was there. They were exiled from Egypt. They were exiled to Egypt, the divine presence went with them. They were exiled to Babylonia, the divine presence went with them. Where in Babylonia does the divine presence reside? Rabbi Abaye said, in the ancient synagogue of Huzal and in the ancient synagogue that was destroyed and rebuilt in Nahardea. Okay, and do not say that the divine presence resided here and there, both places simultaneously. Rather, at times it resided here and times it resided there. So this isn't just a place of prayer. The concept that's being defined or expressed here is what we call mikdash me'at. Mikdash me'at literally means like a mini temple. A place, an institution, which is going to take the place of the temple. The synagogue, even though it's not the temple, this is not the temple in Jerusalem, but in lieu of the temple, we have this sacred space. The synagogue, the sanctuary of the synagogue, the reading of the Torah in the synagogue replaces the synagogue as the sacred space. The concept of mikdash ma'at or mikdash katan, like a mini. Now, it isn't only the synagogue that emerges as this sort of miniature or replacement temple, replacement focal point of spirituality and holiness. The other example of mikdash ma'at is the Shabbat dinner table. Jews in their home, when they eat Shabbat dinner, that's also seen in lieu of the way that the special sacrifices offered in the temple on Shabbat. Have you ever wondered, you go to a basic Friday night, there's Kiddush, and then you make hamotzi. Why do we salt the bread? Why do we salt the challah when we make hamotzi? Because in the temple, when they would offer a sacrifice, they would salt the sacrifice. We salt the challah, not because it needs salt. I mean, this is Jewish food after all. It's always enough salt. We do it because the Shabbat dinner table The challah on the table is not only reminiscent of, but replacing the observance of Shabbat in the temple. So we have these replacement things. Now, if the temple had not been destroyed, these things they were going to happen anyway. There was going to be synagogues, there were going to be Shabbat tables, all of which would have been invested with holiness for Jews outside. Now, I'll give you another example about how Jews in the diaspora, even before the destruction of the temple, and certainly after, they began to conceptualize a kind of parody. This is text number 5 and 6. Now, here are two successive passages from the Talmud, which are using the same kind of poetic construction. Our text number 5 said, Mi shelo ra'ah beit hamikdash bivinyano, one who did not see the temple in its constructed state, this is written after the temple was destroyed, never saw a magnificent structure. Lo ra'ah binyan mefo'ar me'olam. What is the temple building to which the sages refer? Abaye said, and some say, it was Rav Chisda who said, this is referring to the magnificent building of Herod. Now Herod, yes, he corrupted the priesthood, but he was the great builder who beautified the temple. Whenever you go to Jerusalem, especially to the old city of Jerusalem, like the Western Wall, and you see those big stones, Herodian stone, that was the temple as it was beautified by Herod. And it was built to last forever. But Herod's temple, with a beautified version of the second temple, truly magnificent building. It's the ultimate of a magnificent building, which makes sense, it being the temple. But look at text number 6. We're going to see a very similar construction, a very similar expression. All right? And it's actually right after text number 5 in the Talmud. Rabbi Yehuda taught, one who did not see the great synagogue of Alexandria of Egypt never saw the glory of Israel. Yes, the temple is great, but the great synagogue and the great diaspora community of Alexandria, also great. Maybe not the temple exactly, but it's there. So when the temple was gone, that synagogue was still standing. Other synagogues were still standing. In other words, we had these coping methods to deal with the destruction of the temple even before the temple was destroyed. So let me end with one more question, and with one more point, and then maybe we can have some questions. I think the big question we wonder is, if the temple hadn't been destroyed, well, would we still be offering sacrifices today? Isn't that a question we wonder? Sacrifices, certainly from a 21st century point of view, sacrifice is so bizarre. So in a sense, let's apply what we've already learned to answer that specific question. First of all, we know, in a broader global context, religion around the world was moving away from sacrifice. Not for reasons of, let's say, animal cruelty, but sacrifice in the face of, or sacrifice coexisting with personal prayer as a means to communicate to God, just didn't seem as meaningful, as personal, as intimate. It turns out that most people, most religious people, and certainly most Jews, prefer an intimate, immediate connection to God than one that is mediated by a priesthood offering sacrifices. Like, would you, Mr. Priest, please say this, please offer this prayer for me and this animal for me? No, Jews like to be able to, we like a direct line to God. Incidentally, in the Christian world, that's one of the reasons that Protestants stopped being Catholic, because they wanted to talk directly to God rather than speaking through their priesthood. That's the way the world was going. But beyond that, if we're really trying to wonder, I think it's possible the sacrifices might have continued for a while, but they wouldn't have been revered in the same way. At some point, they would have seemed more and more, passé, old worldly, less interesting. Would have gone the way with other sacred rituals which just simply don't resonate with the people, because it's one of the truisms of Judaism, one of the ways that Judaism evolves in this distance and generally, is when something is no longer of interest to most Jews, it tends to disappear. When something doesn't seem right. In the Bible, there was a ritual described in the in the book of Numbers. We read it a few weeks ago. This is the ordeal of the Sota, a woman who was suspected of adultery, who was immersed. She's tried by ordeal, and if she dies, she's guilty, and if she survives, she's innocent. By the time we get to the Talmud already, that ritual is gone. How about the number of crimes in the Bible that are capital punishments? By the time we get to the rabbis, capital punishment, while it still exists on the books, it was virtually defined and legislated out of Judaism. So these are changes that happened. The temple, if it still stood, if it had never been destroyed, would certainly still be the temple. But the significance of the temple would be understood differently. It would be less the center of Jewish prayer, but more like the literal sense of a synagogue. It would be the central place of gathering. Then there's the question of sovereignty. Because remember, it wasn't just the temple that was destroyed, it was also the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, effectively ending Jewish sovereignty. If the temple had been destroyed, what would that have meant? Well, the reality is that 100 years before the temple, when Judea was a province of Rome, it was only semi-independent at best. And remember, for most Jews, that political independence didn't really matter that much. Most Jews had come to terms with, Jews are a very small people. We know how to live under foreign rule. We know how to negotiate that. And so maybe it still would have been a province, maybe, but the significance would have been a lot less. So what we're left with is the trauma of the destruction of the temple that we observe, let's say, on Tisha B'Av, and 2 other minor fast days as well. That it always would have been a traumatic moment. So if the temple hadn't been destroyed, wouldn't have had that traumatic event, but the changes that followed the destruction of the temple were already happening, and many of them were already in place. And so I would say that in a lot of ways, the Jewish world would have headed on the same path, the same course that it already had, that it headed when the temple was destroyed. So a traumatic, cataclysmic event, but an event for which, thankfully for Jews, several centuries of what we call preparation, coping methods were already in place. And that's one of the things that enabled Jews and Judaism and the Jewish people and Jewish communities to survive a moment that was that devastating. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Now we have time for some questions, and among the questions you can ask anything you want. But if there was a particular something you wanted me to say that I didn't, you can definitely ask. So I open the floor to you. Yeah.
How the Jews made it to Rome had the destruction of the temple not taken place?
How did the Jews make it to Rome? The Jews who were in Rome?
No.
Oh.
Didn't the Jews come to Rome as slaves after the destruction?
Great question. About the Jews in Rome. First of all, the first Jews who came to Rome a century before the destruction of the temple. They came to Rome following the Roman conquest of Judea in 63 BCE. The first Jews were captives, and within a decade, long story short, shortly after Jews began arriving, there was a power struggle in Rome between Julius, who later became Julius Caesar, and Pompey. Pompey was the guy who had conquered the land of Israel. So Jews living in Rome, they had to choose a side. Very dangerous choice. They chose to side with Julius, who became Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar gave the Jews of Rome a series of rights, a series of privileges, which became a template for Jewish privileges in the diaspora for the next 1900 years. So when the temple was destroyed, there already was not only a Jewish community in Rome, but an established Jewish community in Rome. And remarkably, the Romans, when they conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, there were no reprisals against Jews anywhere else in the diaspora. That willingness to accommodate foreign rule was, it was mirrored by a willingness of foreign rulers to accommodate Jews. So the Jews of Rome, it wasn't that they weren't affected. They were devastated by the destruction of the temple. But in the history of the Jewish community of Rome, the day before and the day after the destruction of the temple looked pretty much the same. The one difference is one of the things that Julius Caesar had allowed Jews of Rome to do was to send annual donations to the temple. They were allowed to send basically the Jewish equivalent of a tithe to the temple in Jerusalem. When the temple was destroyed, that became an annual donation to the Jewish community. Long before there was federation, Jewish communities were already looking for donations. That's what changed. But the Jewish community was already established. And the Jewish community of Rome goes all the way back to the time of Julius Caesar, a century before the destruction of the temple. It was already there. Good question. Yeah?
Who were some of the zealots who led the 66 revolt?
Who was the leader of the zealots? Great question. One of the nature of the zealots, it's one of the characteristic features of religious extremists that they weren't one group, they were multiple groups. There were dozens of groups of zealots. Each one had their own leader, and each one, not only did they like Jews who weren't zealots, they didn't like the other zealot groups either. So one of the reasons, the zealots were pretty good fighters, but one of the reasons that revolt didn't turn out better is the zealots spent as much time fighting each other zealots, as they did spend fighting Romans. If you ever saw the movie Monty Python's Life of Brian, they parody the zealots. One is called the People's Front of Judea, one is called the Judean People's Front, and there's like 6 others. They're exactly the same, but they hated each other and they fought each other. And even when the Jews were under siege by the Romans in Jerusalem in 69 and 70, the zealots were fighting each other in the city as much as they were fighting others, as much as they were fighting the Romans. That's the nature of zealots. So there was no one leader. There were many leaders, and everyone, it's like one was crazier than the next. If you met a zealot, you just turn around and go the other. You don't want to talk to these people. To call them the equivalent of 21st century gun nuts is an understatement. If they didn't like you, they would just cut your throat and believe they were acting in the name of God. They're out of their mind. What's that? Well, yeah, in 21st century Israel, we have a kind of latter-day version of that crazy zealot mentality willing to use violence to accomplish a religious aim, which is nowhere near being a mainstream Jewish idea, but that's a different story. Yeah? Given the past, what's the future? In terms of the temple now? Well, I'll answer in 2 ways. First of all, we do have this belief that when the Mashiach comes, the temple is going to be rebuilt. And we're all going to return, and Jerusalem's going to be restored. And before that, well, I'd say 2 things. Prior to the Messianic age, the temple has and will always be, and Jerusalem has been and will always be, the center of the Jewish imagination. The temple hasn't been there for 2,000 years, and yet every day, wherever Jews pray, we not only face the land of Israel, we face Jerusalem and the temple. If you live in Israel, if you live in Tel Aviv, you pray towards Jerusalem. If you live in Jerusalem, you face the Temple Mount when you pray, the centerpiece. Has there ever been a Seder which didn't end with the same 3 words, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem? Symbolically, the temple and the city of Jerusalem have been fixed in the Jewish imagination. Now, if when the Mashiach comes and they rebuild the temple, are they going to reinstate the sacrificial service? Maybe, but I would say if they did, it's going to be something very, very different. If nothing else, let's leave aside that we have a very different notion of treating animals that way. Leave that aside, but when the temple stood, there wasn't this entrenched personal prayer. If the temple was rebuilt tomorrow, one of the things that service in the temple would do, whether there were sacrifices or not, I don't really think there would be, but even if there were, those sacrifices would be accompanied by many of the same prayers we say right now. And I have no doubt, and this isn't just me being biased as a Torah reader, they would definitely read Torah in the temple. There is no question that the weekly Torah reading would be the centerpiece of a service in the temple, simply because not only has it resonated so deeply with Jews, but it has connected so many generations of Jews with the Torah. So that I think we still have this deep connection, even though the temple was there. But the nature of that connection would be different, because we're not going to discard what we did afterwards. We're not going to discard what I've called coping mechanisms or changes or whatever. Those are here to stay. Absolutely. But the temple will be important to us in some way or another. In the same way that Jerusalem is important to us. Even if you've never been to Jerusalem, it's still a special place. And when you go, even if when you visit Israel, let's say some of us prefer Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, myself included, Jerusalem has too many Haredim. Tel Aviv has just the right number of Haredim. But I still love Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will always be a special place. And so, if the temple was reinstated, yeah, it would be easy. The specialness of Jerusalem would be a seamless transition because it never stopped being special, even without the temple. And the sacrifices and the temple service never really stopped because even though we don't offer the sacrifices anymore, we read about them and we study about them all the time. We know about them. If you know anything about the temple in Jerusalem, you have an image of what that place was like. It's still very much at the heart of our imagination. Any other questions? Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Sherry.
Herod, when he started reorganizing the priesthood,
Mm-hmm.
that was really 100 years.
100 years before. Well, Herod is probably 70 years before the temple was destroyed.
And that historical faction that the priests were really, a lot of them maybe morally compromised.
Mm-hmm.
Were they, some of them converts to Jews as Herod was, or were they?
Oh, no. These were Jews who they tend to be more... the question was the corrupted priesthood by Herod. Who were they? They weren't outsiders like David brought in. These were Jews. These were priests who simply, I would say, they were coerced by Herod to do Herod's bidding. So they were politicized and their own integrity was compromised. But secondly, these were part of the Jewish upper class, which was basically just tempted by wealth. Herod didn't just say, you're going to be he was bribing everybody. Herod was all about bribing. Okay? Let me make one other point, and then let's see if we have time for one other question. Because the one last thing I didn't mention, I want to mention very briefly, is would Judaism have been the same if the temple was still there? And this is what I put. This is we go by the numbers. On the eve of the destruction of the temple, with all these different groups of Jews, the two largest of these different Jewish groups, these different Jewish mentalities or outlooks, one was the Pharisees, who were the precursors of the rabbis, and the other were Christians. And even before the temple was destroyed, the two large, because remember, Christianity started as an offshoot of Judaism, as a kind of Judaism. They were the two biggest. And when the temple was destroyed, they became both dominant. So rabbinic Judaism became Judaism, and the Christians eventually separated. That's a separate story. But by the numbers, even if the temple hadn't been destroyed, simply, they were attracting the most. The two competing forms of Judaism in the first century were still going to be the Judaism of the rabbis that we now practice and the messianic form of Judaism by Christians. And eventually Christians were going to be defined out of Judaism because of their own beliefs. So that relationship probably would have wound up the same. And certainly, Judaism becoming the Judaism of the rabbis was well underway even before the destruction of the temple. Hillel and Shammai lived almost a century before. And once the temple was destroyed, it just continued along that path. So Judaism probably would have wound up being the same Judaism we had. I think we have time for one more question. Was there a question back there? Was anyone a question?
You answered my question.
Oh, good.
You asked about the Christians.
Yes. Okay. All right, if there are no other questions, next week we're going to talk about our next event is going to be about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and we'll ask a similar set of questions about that. That'll be interesting too. I hope to see you next week. What's that?